So this video is going to be a very brief introduction to the structure of the heart and its different parts, its chambers, the atrium, the ventricle, the major blood vessels that attach to it, and then the valves, the little doorways that we find inside the heart to make sure that blood always flows in the same direction. So the first thing is every organ in your body has a membrane that goes around it, and your heart has a membrane called the pericardium. In anatomy, anytime you see peri, P-E-R-I, peri, like perimeter, means it's on the outside of something. And cardi, as you know, means heart. So the name pericardium means it's around the outside of the heart. And it is the double membrane that we find around our heart. Like I mentioned, every organ in your body has a membrane that goes around it. And that membrane helps keep it moist. That membrane also helps hold it in place. It helps protect it. And in the case of your heart, you know your heart is found in your thorax, your chest region. And we're constantly moving, and our heart doesn't bounce up and down like a ball. It's held in place. And the membrane that holds it in place is this thing called the pericardium. Now, membranes that we go around our organs usually have 2 layers. There are exceptions to the rules, like your kidneys, the membranes are actually 3 layers, and your brain and spinal cord also have 3 layers. But in the case of your pericardium, the membrane around your heart, it is made up of 2 layers. Now, every organ in your body has a membrane that goes around it, and with a few exceptions, these membranes will always have 2 layers. And the outer membrane is always called the parietal layer. So if you were to touch an organ that still has the membrane on it, you would be touching the parietal layer. So around the heart, that's what we call the parietal pericardium. The innermost layer is called the visceral layer. The term visceral often means organs. And so this would be the layer under the parietal layer. So every membrane has, in our bodies, with the exception of a few, have 2 layers. The outside layer will always be called the parietal layer, and the inside layer will always be called the visceral layer. So in the case of the pericardium, it's the parietal pericardium and is the visceral pericardium. Now, these membranes also need to be kept separate. We don't want, since these organs are constantly moving, like in the case of your heart, it does beat. In the case of your smooth muscle, it does pulse, it does peristalsis. So we have to make sure that these organs don't rub up against each other and create friction. So there's always going to be a fluid between these 2 layers of membrane. And most of the time, the fluid is named after the membrane itself. So in the case of your pericardium, the fluid is called the pericardial fluid. And this fluid separates the 2 membranes. It keeps them from sticking together. As the heart beats, it reduces friction so that these membranes aren't rubbing up against each other. Now, you can have what's called pericarditis. Remember, anytime you see itis, that means it is an inflammation. Pericarditis is an inflammation of the pericardium. It can be caused by a viral infection. It can be caused by a bacterial infection. It can be caused by extreme violent motion that damages the pericardium. But when you have inflammation, in the case, inflammation is part of our immune system. And with inflammation, our bodies create high amounts of histamine. And histamine will cause tissues to swell. Well, if tissues swell, such as the pericardium, then your body's going to create more of this fluid to keep those tissues apart. Well, it's like you lying on the floor and me putting wet blanket after wet blanket after wet blanket on top of you. Eventually, it'll begin to squish you. Well, that can happen with pericarditis. There can be the inflammation of the membrane around the heart can be so bad, and you have an increase of pericardial fluid that actually begins to put pressure on the heart, and the heart has a harder time beating and doing its job. Now, in our body, we have 2 types of blood. We have what we call oxygenated blood, and we have what we call deoxygenated blood. And oxygenated blood is nutrient-rich blood that needs to go to our body organs in order to give them oxygen and nutrients. Deoxygenated blood has no oxygen in it. It carries carbon dioxide, so it basically is mostly waste products. So when we look at our heart, we talk about the loops. Our heart has 4 chambers. It has 2 atrium on the top and 2 ventricles on the bottom, and we're going to talk about those chambers. But as you know, with your heart, you do have a left side and you have a right side, because we have a wall that goes right down the middle of our heart, right here, and that wall is called the septum. Anytime you see septum in anatomy, that's something that gives you a left side and a right side. Just like you have your nasal septum, so you have a left nostril and a right nostril, we have the septum of the heart. And that septum divides our heart into a left side and into a right side. And this is to keep those 2 types of blood from mixing together. You don't want deoxygenated blood mixing with oxygenated blood. The right side of your heart is responsible for deoxygenated blood, and the left side of your heart holds oxygenated blood. Now keep in mind, the blood passing through your heart does not give your heart nutrients. Your heart has its own blood vessels, and we'll talk about that in a different video. But with the septum makes sure that the blood does not mix. So the right side of your heart is where deoxygenated blood goes, and the left side of your heart is where oxygenated blood goes. So therefore, we have what we call the two loops. Both sides of your heart work at the same time, and they're both going to pump blood to a certain spot. Well, depending on where it's pumped, we're going to have what we call a loop. Now, like I mentioned, the right side of your heart contains deoxygenated blood, and its job is to send that blood to your lungs. So blood will go from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart. So it's going to loop around. So in the case of what we call the pulmonary loop, anytime you see pulmonary, that's referring to your lungs. So the pulmonary loop is done by the right side of your heart. It's going to take deoxygenated blood, and it's going to send blood to the lungs where it gets oxygenated, and then it's going to come back. Now, when it comes back, it's not going to come back to the right side of the heart because the right side of the heart only carries deoxygenated blood. When it comes back, it's going to go to the left side of the heart. The left side of your heart contains oxygenated blood, and its job is to pump that blood to your body. And this is what we call the systemic loop because it's pumping it to the different systems. So if you were a blood cell, you would go from the right side of the heart to the lungs, to the left side of the heart, to the body, back to the right side of the heart, lungs, left side, body, right side. So it kind of makes like this little figure eight. So this is what we talk about when we talk about the loops. This is the passage that blood takes. So the left side of the heart is oxygenated blood. It's going to do the systemic loop. It's going to pump blood to the body, and then that blood will pick up waste products and come back to the right side of the heart. The right side of the heart will then take that blood that has carbon dioxide in it and take it to the lungs where gas exchange takes place. Oxygen gets put in the blood, and it comes back to the left side of the heart. So as you can see in this picture, you'll notice that there are reds and blues. And the reason for that, we use these to represent oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. All blood is red, but in the case of deoxygenated blood, it has high amounts of carbon dioxide in it. Most of the veins in your body turn blue because of the fact that carbon dioxide causes a reaction in body temperature in body tissues that turns your tissues blue. So we're going to talk about the major blood vessels that we have in our body in regards to where they connect to the heart. Now, like I mentioned, as mammals, we have 4 chambers. We have 2 atrium and we have 2 ventricles. The atrium are the chambers on the top, and the ventricles are the chambers on the bottom. And by definition, the atrium are what we call your collecting chambers. They tend to be thinner. They're a muscle wall, which is called the myometrium, myo meaning muscle. The myometrium of the atrium are thinner than the myometrium in the ventricle. Because your atrium, this is where when the blood comes back to the heart, it's like the gallon jug that we fill up. And so these chambers need to be able to stretch. So they tend to be more elastic. These chambers tend to be thinner. And then we have the ventricles, which are what we call the pumping chambers. These are the ones that have thicker muscle because it's their job to squeeze and push blood out. Now remember, muscles are what we call antagonistic, which means every muscle has a partner. They work opposite of each other. Atrial muscles are partners to ventricle muscles. They are antagonistic to each other. They are opposing with each other. So basically what that means is when the atrium is filling up, it is stretching open. You're filling it up like a water balloon. The ventricle is squeezing shut in order to push blood out. And then as the ventricle begins to fill up, the atrium is squeezing shut. So they're going to work opposites of each other. So what actually happens is blood goes to the heart and ends up in the atrium. The atrium then pushes the blood into the ventricle, and the ventricle will then push the blood out in whichever loop that it needs to go in. Now, anything that's hollow will have a lining on it. Now, the membrane around the outside of the heart is called the pericardium. The membrane on the inside of the heart is called the endocardium. Because your heart is hollow, stuff does flow through it, and muscles are folded, so it's very much like speed bumps. We want blood to be able to go through the heart very smoothly. So we take the inner chambers and we line them with a very smooth membrane in order to reduce friction, and that's what's called the endocardium. Now, we're going to look at the atrium first. We do have two atrium. We have a left atrium and we have a right atrium. And the left atrium is where oxygenated blood comes back to the heart from the lungs, and the right atrium is where deoxygenated blood comes back to the heart from the different parts of the body. And like I mentioned before, these are what we call your collecting chambers. So they are more elastic, they tend to be thinner than your ventricles, and they are made from cardiac muscle. But cardiac muscle is a tissue type. Just like your biceps is made from skeletal muscle tissue, you have lots of different muscles in your heart. They're all made from cardiac muscle tissue. But the muscles of your atrium are called your pectinate muscles. And the muscles of your atrium are folded. And these folds are what we call rugae, R-U-G-A-E. Anytime you see rugae, rugae is a fold that's there in order for that organ to be able to stretch. So the urinary bladder has rugae. The stomach has rugae. The uterus has rugae. But the muscles that make up your atrium are what we call your pectinate muscles, and they are highly folded so that they can stretch as blood comes in. Now, in the case of your heart, the largest arteries and the largest veins in your body connect to your heart. And at the right atrium, we have the two largest veins we have in our body. We have the superior vena cava and we have the inferior vena cava. And they both join together in order to take blood into your right atrium. The superior vena cava carries deoxygenated blood from the top half of your body, while the inferior vena cava carries deoxygenated blood from the lower part of your body. But this is the largest vein that you have in your body, and it connects to your right atrium. Likewise, another very large vein attaches to your left atrium, and this is what's called the pulmonary veins. And the pulmonary veins are special because they are the only veins in your body to carry oxygenated blood. All other veins in your body carry deoxygenated blood. Now, keep in mind, by definition, veins carry blood back to the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. And so you'll see that the letters don't match up. And what I mean by that, atrium starts with an A, arteries start with an A. Ventricle starts with a V, veins start with a V. The two A's do not come together, and the two V's do not come together. The A's and V's join up. So the atria have veins attached to them, while the ventricles will have arteries attached to them. Well, the two most important veins you have in your body attach to your heart. In the case of your right atrium, you have the vena cava. The vena cava are bringing deoxygenated blood from the body back to the heart. And then from the right side of your heart, it will get pumped to the lungs where it gets oxygen, and then it needs to come back to the heart. So it's going to come back to your heart through what we call the pulmonary veins. And again, the pulmonary veins are special because these are some of the only veins you have in your body that are pink, meaning they're not carrying carbon dioxide, so they don't turn blue. These are some of the only veins in your body to carry oxygenated blood. You do have two because one has to come from each lung, and they will merge in the back before they enter the left atrium. Now, in the case of the fetal heart, as a fetus, you do not need to do the pulmonary loop, meaning you're not breathing. You get most of your oxygen from your mother's bloodstream. So in a typical heart, as you can see here in this picture, blood would go from the right atrium into the right ventricle so that it can be pumped to the lungs. Well, in the case of a fetus, we need to be able to bypass the pulmonary loop. We don't need to send blood to the lungs in order for gas exchange to take place. So what we find in fetal hearts is a small opening. You might have heard of infants that were born with holes in their hearts. Well, this is what it's referring to. As a fetus, we have this small opening right here. It is called the foramen ovule. Anytime you see foramen, foramen means that something is a hole. Well, this allows blood then. Some blood will still go through the pulmonary loop, but a lot of the blood will bypass this loop, and it will go from the right atrium straight into the left atrium. And because our lungs are not a site of gas exchange yet, it basically saves a lot of time. Well, usually by the time you're 7 or 8 months old, this hole should have filled in. And so we all have a little scar there, and it's called the fossa ovulis. Now, if you've listened to my bone PowerPoint lectures before, anytime you see foramen, foramen is a hole. And anytime you see fossa, fossa is kind of like a socket or an indentation. You guys all have scabs on your skin that have scarred, and you know that your skin is not perfect. Well, when this hole closes, it doesn't leave it like perfectly straight. It does leave a small indentation where that scar is, and that's what's called the fossa ovulis. Well, children who are born with holes in their hearts were born before this hole had a chance to close. And so therefore, blood is bypassing the pulmonary loop. So a lot of times if children are born with holes in their hearts, the doctors will kind of wait to see what happens. But if it's serious enough, they will have to go in and close that opening so that the deoxygenated blood does not mix with the oxygenated blood. Now your ventricles are your thicker chambers. These are what we call the pumping chambers of your heart. So they have to have thicker walls than the atrium. And so you can look in the anatomy coloring book, or you can pause this video and go backwards and look at the diagrams that I have here, and you'll see that the walls of the ventricle are a lot thicker than the walls of the atrium. And this is because they need to have this pressure. We need to shoot blood out of our hearts. It's just very much like, pressure building up in the balloon until it pops, and that explosion. So we need to have that high pressure in order for our blood to go where it needs to go. So therefore, the ventricles tend to be more narrow, and they tend to be thicker in order to build up that pressure. Now, the right ventricle is actually the thinner of the two. Now, both ventricles are thicker than your atrium, but your right ventricle simply pumps things through the pulmonary loop. So it's pumping blood to the lungs, and the lungs are right there. So they're not going to be as thick as, for example, the left ventricle. Now, in the previous slide, I mentioned how the major blood vessels are attached to your heart. And in the case of your right atrium, the largest vein of your body attaches. That was your superior and inferior vena cava. And your left atrium had the pulmonary arteries. And these were, the pulmonary veins. And these were special because they were the only veins in your body to carry oxygenated blood. I'm getting myself mixed up. Well, in the case of the ventricles, the right ventricle has what we call the pulmonary trunk. And the pulmonary trunk will then split, like a trunk of a tree, into two branches called the pulmonary arteries, one going to each lung. So the right atrium and the left atrium had veins attached to them. Remember, your ventricles are going to have arteries attached to them. And in the case of your pulmonary arteries, these are special because they're the only arteries in your body to carry deoxygenated blood. Remember, by definition, arteries carry blood away from the heart. And 99% of all of your arteries carry oxygenated blood. Here is the exception to the rule. Now, your left ventricle is thicker than your right ventricle because it needs to pump blood to the entire body. And it has to have enough pressure that when the blood starts circulating back up, it can deal with gravity. And the left ventricle has the largest artery you have in your body, which is your aorta. So in the case of your right atrium, it had the largest vein in your body, the vena cava. In the case of your left atrium, it had the pulmonary veins attached to it. And these are the only veins in your body to carry oxygenated blood. The right ventricle has the pulmonary trunk and pulmonary arteries attached to it. These are the only arteries in your body to carry deoxygenated blood. And then the left ventricle has the largest artery in your body, the aorta, and that's what pumps blood to the rest of your body. Now, your ventricles also have folded muscle in them, and these muscles are what are called the trabecula carni, and they're responsible for opening valves. You have two major sets of valves in your heart, and valves are kind of like doors. And just like most doors, they can only swing one way. It's very important to make sure that blood goes where it's supposed to go. Remember, when the atrium is squeezing shut, the ventricles are opening up. That's going to create a suction to help suck blood into the ventricle. When the ventricles are squeezing shut, the atrium is opening up. Well, the atrium is going to create a suction. You do not want to suck the blood that you just pushed into the ventricle back into the atrium. So you will find that there is a door between the atrium and the ventricle. There's also a door between the ventricle and the two arteries. So as the ventricles are opening up, they don't suck the blood back into them that they just pushed out of those arteries.